Hi, welcome back. This is episode 2 of our series on recalls with Bob Manning, author of In the Midst of a Recall. And in our first episode, we talked a little bit about what was the inspiration for this book and what is the author's background. But we looked at the idea of how the book is organized, and we talked about this idea of being recall ready. So, Bob, thank you for joining us. And I
Hmm.
have to ask
Thank
you,
you.
what is recall readiness?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, it's something that companies will focus on a small component of it, but they won't look at the big picture. And what I mean by that is, so recall readiness is, from my perspective, is to make sure that you're fully prepared in the event a recall should happen, which sounds great. But unfortunately, the truth of the matter is when people are exercising mock recalls, they actually are only looking at a part of that. They're looking at the traceability piece. And, I actually was just with a client and I said, let's talk about mock recalls. And they said, okay, great. We're 100% compliant on our traceability. I said, okay, well, like what else? And I said, well, that's really all that we look at. But the truth of it is that when you have a recall, that's just a small, tiny little portion of what happens. And, when we look at the experiences that I had gone through in multiple cases and what others have gone through, when you have a recall or from a recall readiness perspective, you need to have a full inclusivity with regard to everything that's going on. So to talk about, and I think we're going to get in this in later episodes, but from a recall readiness perspective, it's not only understanding the traceability part, which is a very important part, but it's everything beyond that. So it's all of the business components, the sales, the marketing, because now all when you initiate a recall, there is a lot of concern and there's a lot of communications that are flowing back and forth, and a lot of people are worried, is it my product, is it this product, what product is at stake? And so then you have regulators that you have to deal with, you have your business entities to deal with, your customers, you have your CEO and the legal side of things, you have your consumers to deal with. And so you have all of these moving parts. So when I look at recall readiness, the traceability is important, yes. And yet that has to be accurate because uh, when you initiate a recall, you want to make sure that you go out with that message one time. And what we see today is we're seeing a lot of expansions of recalls. Like, oh, we had a recall, and then a week later, well, we're going to expand that recall. And I don't think there's anything worse for a business than to have a multitude of different messages saying, oh, we have to expand this. It's worse than we thought. So yes, that traceability component is critical, but it's everything outside of there. And it's really to say, okay, is our organization aligned with what's going on? And are they educated in this area? And what we had seen was when a recall was initiated, it's like no one really knew what to do outside of the facility, outside of the traceability exercise. So that readiness component is all of the business functions, both from a facility standpoint and from a business standpoint, to make sure that they're all aligned, they're all working together to drive to the right course of action moving forward. So it sounds easy, but like I said, with this client that I was just with recently, they said, well, we never include our executive teams. It's like, well, they're the ones that are going to have to answer to investors or shareholders or stakeholders, or, they're the ones that are going to have to do the explaining. So again, you have that strategic and that tactical um, approach from two different teams. So that recall readiness has to incorporate everybody through that process.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the idea that it has to incorporate everybody because, it's not something that someone just generates a form and files that form from that one office kind of a deal and says, "Oh yeah, we're recall
Right.
ready." I've often likened it to the difference between, "Oh yeah, we have airbags." I have airbags in my vehicle. I've never seen them deployed. I don't,
Right.
I make the assumption they work kind of a thing. I hope they work,
You hope
but
they
I
work, right?
actively engage by putting on my seatbelt and making
Right.
sure that everyone in my car puts on their seatbelt because we are aware of potential risks and we want to be proactive and be recall ready and say, look, we will be better off if we have both the seatbelt and the airbags
Right.
in the need. And even, just recently, remember that plane that crashed in Toronto and everyone got out
Mhm.
alive?
Yeah.
Think about that. I know it's not a
Yep.
recall, but what were they ready for? When they were
Yeah.
landing, right?
Right.
They made sure
Right.
their seatbelts are on and their tables or trays were in the upright
Yeah.
position and all that kind
Yep.
of stuff. You start to think, wow, you take it for granted or oh, it's an
Right.
inconvenience when they tell you to get ready for landing. But everyone walked away from that crash because they were the airplane landing equivalent of recall ready.
That's right. Yeah, and they did a fantastic job. And a lot of that you're hitting the nail on the head there is the training part, right? So if every one of those messages on a plane is in a sense an awareness level of training, right? They're not telling you why. They're not saying, "Hey, we're coming in for a landing and the plane could possibly flip over because we have strong headwinds." Well, they wouldn't say that, right? But they are preparing you and getting you mentally prepared to the point where they executed everything flawlessly. Now, I'm sure there's more information to come out with regard to how it happened, but I would argue that that pilot did a phenomenal job in the sense that it didn't turn into a fireball, right? And that could have happened, right? So again, I don't know any of the details as to who was flying or how they were doing, but I'm sure there's going to be criticisms on both sides, but
Yeah,
it's
but
the actions that the pilot.
I'd like to say that whereas, we could say the pilot and co-pilot did their jobs right, the flight crew did their jobs and the
Mhm.
passengers did their
That's right.
jobs. And if
That's right.
all of the various stakeholders had not
That's right.
done their jobs in terms of being ready,
Yep.
that could have turned out far differently.
You're absolutely right. It was everybody working together, as what you said earlier. You're absolutely right. I mean, if you had one passenger that decided, hey, I'm gonna take my luggage, and I know it's not gonna fit out that door, but I'm gonna try to make it fit, and now it blocks everybody, and so that one component could cause that whole thing to unravel. So you're absolutely right. It's everybody working together for a common objective of let's get out of the plane.
So then what could be a big mistake a company is making if their food safety and quality assurance team is ready for a recall? They are recall ready, but
Mhm.
warehouse and distribution and security and sanitation and media and public relations and the legal team, they're not ready for it.
Right. What I believe, and I actually just wrote about this in Food Safety Magazine, it's really some of the red flags. And what I would say, it all goes back to the culture. And I believe, what this is what I truly believe, that your culture is determined by the head of your organization, whoever that is, a CEO, a co-CEO. And it's making sure that at that table there is a strong voice of the quality or food safety side, and they have the same level of authority. But what we see today is that sometimes it's like the quality VP reports to the operations VP, who reports to the CEO. And what I believe is when you have a cross-functional team, whatever team it is, the executive leadership team or the plant teams, when you have an executive leadership team that really is focused on doing the right thing, and you had mentioned that earlier, doing the right thing and making sure that everybody has an opportunity to speak, everybody is being listened to, that you have a culture of psychological safety where people can escalate concerns and they can bring up things that are very uncomfortable to talk about so they can get resolved. It's at that level that will make or break an organization. So if they have their CEO says, look, we are going to focus on running a business, which is operations and making money, but we are also going to do it with the consumer and their safety in mind to make sure that we put out the highest quality product possible and drives the business that way. That's where they'll see great success. And unfortunately, you see it with companies after the fact. You see companies that have recalls and then they see the light and then they really do some great things. You know, in the past, like Jack in the Box, right? So they have Jack in the Box or Maple Leaf Foods. Like some of these organizations have really embraced what they've learned and through some horrific tragedies. And you have Boar's Head, which they're now in the news. You have these horrific events that affect families and everyone. But they they turn the organization around and they say, look, this will never happen again. And what I'm hoping is that like through everything that I'm doing is it's getting people to think that way right now, so it never becomes a concern. So they're always in the forefront, right?
Yeah, it seems, and I've written about this extensively lately, the idea of, you know, yeah, you can say, well, Jack in the Box turned things around after 1993, but our modern food safety culture in the bigger sense was kind of, just beginning then. I mean, this was the
Right,
landmark event.
right.
You look at Chipotle 20 years later, when you look at
Yeah,
Boar's Head 30 years later, and Boar's Head's been around for
right.
120 years. They
Yeah, right,
predated their company operations started before Upton Sinclair published the
right.
journal. There is a point where you just can't say that long established multi-state or multinational companies today can, reactively they'll figure it out now.
Right.
Perhaps when you look at the idea of the legal and economic and ethical and philanthropic responsibilities, I'm thinking Archie Carroll's Pyramid of Corporate Social Responsibility.
Mhm.
There's obviously a focus on the economic responsibilities, right? The
Sure.
responsibility to stakeholders and keeping the business going. But what role do you see legal counsel in terms of those not just legal, but also ethical kind of
Mhm.
responsibilities? Do you see them as a bridge between if you will, the top and bottom of the totem pole?
I do. When I look at, it's interesting because I grew up in a very ethical household. My dad was he was a great person. And so but I've worked for some very ethical people. Like the person that owned HP Hood, just a phenomenal ethical human being. But these people didn't talk about ethics. They didn't have to talk about ethics. They actually drove it through the organization. But when you look at it from a legal perspective and bridging that gap, there's somebody that needs to communicate that message from the top all the way through the organization. And what we see today is from a leadership perspective is the more that can happen, the better off that message will be heard at the lower levels. And so whether it's the legal teams, HR, it's really to take that message from the top, and hopefully it's the person at the top. He or she is getting out into the plants and talking about this and walking the floor with employees. And that was one of the things that this gentleman had done, the owner of Hood. Every year he would go out to all the plants and he would walk through the floor and he would talk to people and he encouraged people to tell him what the problems were. And so that's just one person. But when you look at it from the legal teams and the regulatory people, it's really getting out and getting that message out so they can share not only what their expectations are, but they can actively listen to see what the challenges are. And when it's like, okay, you know, um, your legal teams are out there first and foremost, and it's going to take a while for people to really open up to you. But when they start to do that, it's responding to what they're telling you and fixing the problems because they're living it every single day.
Yeah.
Whereas, the messages at the executive teams, that's truthfully, that's all filtered. By the time it gets to that level, it's filtered. And so having that legal team be able to get out into the facilities and bridge that gap and to share those experiences and have the training sessions and get and build those relationships, the better off an organization will be.
Well, Bob, I'm excited to talk a little bit more beyond recall readiness, but the idea of being engaged in a proactive approach in general in our next episode. So we'll see you on the next side.
Sounds great. Thank you.